right. Hello. Welcome to yesterlore. I am Grimm's lawyer, and we are here finishing, hopefully, probably, the section of the hávamál, which is called, by modern scholars, rúnatal. And we got through, let's see, it was 1, 2, 3, 4 stanzas last time. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4 stanzas left. So we're exactly halfway done. Might be off by a line or so, but we're pretty much halfway done with rúnatal, this short section. So we're going to finish that today. If you want a more in-depth introduction to what rúnatal is, you can see my last stream, which is up on YouTube still. And at the time of streaming this, it's also still on Twitch. But that will be not the case next week. We are looking at, in the Codex Regius, this section, starting here. And we got to here. Let me zoom in. We got here. So we have one line left on this page of the manuscript. And we're going to look at the manuscript a bit, but mostly we're going to be looking at this typed version just because it's a bit easier to see. I will start, though, by looking at this, because here we get a really nice looking capital R. It's like kind of slanted a bit, and it's got this little flourish, like swoosh up from the kickstand. And we have, let's see, we have a nice little example of an abbreviation here, another abbreviation. And this is an interesting kind of abbreviation, because it's an abbreviation that skips the vowel, which is kind of similar to the little R apostrophe looking thing that we looked at last time. But here, what we have is an M and then a T, and it has a line over the N. And the line, if you remember the other manuscripts we've looked at, especially the Old English ones, the line over a letter typically means that the next letter is a nasal sound, so an N or an M. Before a T, it's probably an N. But this word probably is an MNT, because Old Norse would probably need a vowel there. That's allowable in some languages, but not really Old Norse. So we have to infer that there is also a vowel before that N, and we're pretty sure, but looking at other manuscripts and just context, that this is the word munt, and that's what I've written here, munt, M-U-N-T, when really it's just M with a little line over it, and then T. But it's pretty clear that it's munt. Any other interesting things to point out? I don't think there's anything super interesting, except the fact that there is an accent over here. I think this isn't our first accent that we've noticed, but this is an accent over this O here, and I've recorded it here. Now, I've mentioned this before, that usually the accent marks, which at this time period in both Old English and Old Norse indicate length, just how long you hold the vowel, they're usually not written. They're usually just native speakers know what the word is and therefore know that it's a long O and don't need to write it. But occasionally you'll see an accent mark, and we're not always sure why we sometimes see it, if it was so clear most of the time. So some people think it might be a metrical thing, like not only is it long, but they're kind of emphasizing that that's the part of the poem that the oral poet would put more emphasis on or something. But it's just kind of haphazard where we see an accent versus not. It might even be just a smudge, like they just lifted their pen a little too late or something. Hello, chat. Someone in chat saying hello. So that is the thing that I wanted to point out. That was it for this line on the manuscript at the bottom of this page. So I'm going to go ahead and read the actual stanza while I amend it to sort of be more normalized Old Norse, and then we'll start translating. So before I do that, though, I do want to say where we left off. We were talking about the god Odin. He's saying that he hung from a tree for 9 nights, didn't get any food or water, and then he took up the runes, ambiguous as to whether that's physically or sort of mentally, took them up as in learned them. Normalize Old Norse. Yes, that's what I'm going to do. Love the emoji there. So he takes up the runes, and he, at that point, fell from the tree. Maybe he got down, maybe he died, who knows. And then it says that he took 9 great poems or songs from this guy Balthor, which is death, thunder, thunder, death. We're not sure who this person is, or who Bestla is, of whom they are the father, this Bestla person here. And then it says, I got a drink from the precious mead. And that mead is probably a reference to the mead of poetry that's referenced in other stories. So the skill to interpret runes, the skill to recite songs, poems, that is what Odin is saying he is getting from this whole complex of experiences. And then he kind of talks about what happened then. He says, I took I forgot what we said there. I'm actually spending too much time on this review. Basically, where we left off was here, where we had the words flowed to words, finding words, and works flowed from works, finding works. Or we talked about there are many different translations of this part, but it seems to be a preservation of an older formula that exists in other Germanic languages where it alliterates there, but it does not alliterate here because V doesn't alliterate with W or with O. The V represents a W sound, W, and the W that used to be here, the word orð, which is word, used to be word. The W goes away and therefore no longer alliterates with werk here. And so they no longer alliterate, so it's been stretched onto 2 separate lines, and they have to alliterate with themselves instead. There's just the repetition. So that's where we left off. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here and normalize stuff. So it says, Runar munt þú finna och raðna stafi, mjokk stóra stafi, mjokk stinna stafi, faði fimbulþulur, och gerðu ginregin, och reist hróptur rotna. So, what the heck does that mean? First, I'm going to fix some stuff. We're going to have runar with a long U. I have thu also with a long U. Whoops. Raðna has long A. Raðna. And these are more lower back all. This is probably Garðu. Okay, we're good. So what does this say? Runar is, I think, a word we've seen. Runar is just runes. It's the plural of rune. Runar is rune. Runes, plural. And it says, Runar munt thu. Now, munt is from the verb munu, which is basically what we call an auxiliary verb. It is used to indicate the future. most of the time. It's like the word will in English. And it's in the second person singular. Whoops, I don't know how that happened. Second person singular, because here we have thu right after it, which we've seen in Old English as well, means you. Thou, it is the origin of the word thou. So, you will finna och ravna. So, you will find, finna is find, runes, and ravna stavi. So stavi here means a stave, and this is another word for letter, like a letter, because runes are letters. So this word ravna here, this is the past participle of the verb rava, which is cognate to the word read in modern English, although in both Old English and in Old Norse, these cognates meant a much wider array of things. Any kind of interpretation that happens, or counsel, advice, any kind of thing that falls into that general category of interpreting and offering interpretations was rava or radan in Old English. And it in fact exists in modern English in that later sense, kind of, in the etymology of certain names. Any name that ends with R-E-D that comes from Old English and modern English has that word rad as a suffix. So like Alfred, I'm trying to think of other names with red at the end. Alfred's the only one that's really coming to mind at the moment. But Alfred means elf, counsel, basically. But here, rava probably means interpret or read. It is a past participle, so it's like interpreted or read runes, letters. Then we have mjök, stora stavi. Mjök it means very, at least in this context. It's cognate with the word mycket that we've seen in Old English and with much in modern English. So very stor. Stor means great. Whoa, sorry. I just scared my dog. It means great. So very great runes. And then we have mjök, stinna stavi. And stinna means stiff. They're very stiff or reliable, sturdy. This could be a reference to their shape. They're usually pretty, as we've seen, pretty, I don't know, much in straight lines because they were carved usually. Or it could just be that they're reliable runes in a less sort of literal interpretation of stiff. So we have, you will find runes and interpreted letters, very great letters, very stiff letters, whatever you want stiff to mean. Now, this little symbol that I put here, this is actually just a link to this page, which is the next page, and that indicates to me that that is where the new page starts, because the first word on the next page is stinna stavi, and you'll see this small capital N, which, as I mentioned last time, indicates that it's the same letter twice. So when we see a capital N, that means two lowercase n's. It mostly happens with N. It doesn't really happen with that many other letters. I think I've seen once or twice a different letter. I'm not remembering at the moment what it was, but it mostly happens with N, because N is really commonly doubled because of some sound changes that happened in Norse. So the next word, or the next line, it says erfavi thimbuthulur. So, which, and then we have this word favi, which normalized it would probably be written this way, which is the past tense of fa. Now there are two verbs fa in Old Norse. One of them is cognate with Old English fon, and it means to take or to receive. This one is not that. It's giving Spanish ñ. Oh yeah, the double N. Yeah, no. The line over the word or letter to indicate the nasal is the origin of ñ here. We looked at this earlier. Munt here is just abbreviated M, line over it T, because there's an N. Well, there's a U and then an N after this M. Here, is there another example in this line? No, there is not. How about this line? Fimbul thulur. Is there another nasal somewhere? This is another small capital N. We have one on this line. We have alvo with a line over the O that indicates that there's an M after it. But yeah, it is kind of, it's the same sort of thing. It's like the double N being abbreviated in some way, just like ñ was originally in Spanish. So this fall means to paint or to draw in some way. So this is the past tense of that. This the is like our ed suffix in English. It's indicating that it's past tense. So which fáði fimbulthulur. So which fimbulthulur painted or drew. Now who's fimbulthulur? We're pretty sure that that is Odin himself who's speaking. Fimbul, we had that prefix way up here. It basically just meant like exceedingly. It's like another way of saying very, but with more heavy connotations of like awesomeness. And then thulur means a sage or a poet. So like the most excellent poet. Which, who else but Odin would that be, really? Actually, there are a couple other candidates that I can think of, but we're pretty sure it's another by name of Odin. Thula, there is a noun thula also, which means an alliterative poem, which is what we're reading. So that's kind of cool that this name for Odin is also related to the word for an alliterative poem. Yeah, Fimbulthulur, which we usually just kind of combine because it seems to be a proper noun. It seems to be a name. So you will find these runes, these awesome letters, which Odin made, he painted, and which Ginregen Gurdo. In sort of later Old Icelandic, this would probably just be Gerdo, and that's what it is. Gerdo is what it is in Icelandic, I believe, modern Icelandic. And it means made, so which Ginregen made, and the Ginregen are the great gods. Regen means gods. It's the plural of Regen. I just got completely lost in my train of thought. Oh yeah, if you've heard of Ragnarok is what it actually is. There's actually debate about what this element here is. Is it Ruk, or is it Rukur, or something else? There's a lot of debate about how to parse that, but this part, this is the part that means of the gods, because Regen means gods in Old Norse. I did not mean to do that. Alright, so which the great gods made. Gin as a prefix means great. And reist hroptur rugna. So this verb reist is the verb rista. And a rista means to cut or to carve. And this is just the past tense of that. So which hroptur carved. Sorry, I forgot to tell my phone to not notify me during this stream. And yet it's doing so, sorry. Okay. We're good now. So Hroptur is another name for Odin. It shows up sometimes. The etymology is unknown. We don't know where this word comes from. There's a lot of scholarship on it, but we just don't know for sure where the name comes from. It's just another name for Odin. And Odin carved. And then this is, again, this is the genitive plural, again, of regen. Among the gods is probably what that would mean there. That sort of interpretation of the genitive plural. So, let's go over this stanza one more time. It says, you will find runes and great letters, very great letters, or sorry, interpreted letters, very great letters, very stiff letters, which Odin made, and the great gods, or which Odin painted, the great gods made, and Odin carved among the gods. A lot of repetition there. Now, let's go into the next stanza, and we've got, why does Odin have so many names? That is a question that people are still trying to answer. He has a lot of names. Actually, I want to show you something really interesting real quick. We're going to go to the Wikipedia page for a list of names of Odin. You'll see I had a search that was list of names of Freyr there too. He has a lot of names, but not nearly as many as Odin. And you'll just see how extensive this is. I have my own personal ideas as to why, but just to give you an idea, it's in alphabetical order, and it also gives you where you'll see the name. Some of these aren't given sources, but they do exist. The people who put together this Wikipedia article, I just haven't found the sources for all of them yet. But yeah, it just keeps going. There are just a lot of names for Odin. My personal theory as to why is because Odin is a deity that's associated with poets. Like we read last week about how he drank the mead of poetry. And yeah, good Lord, that's so many. Yeah, truly. He's associated with poets. So if you are a poet composing poetry about a god, which god are you most likely to be like wanting to give thanks to as sort of like your patron deity? Now there are other Old Norse deities for poetry that are associated with poetry, but Odin was sort of the most widely sort of attested one. And he has sort of analogs in other Germanic languages and cultures that we've seen. So if all your poets are venerating Odin, or just sort of like paying respect to Odin in their compositions, Odin is going to be like, just by the nature of where our sources are coming from, they're coming from poetry, he's going to be mentioned the most. And because it's poetry that needs to alliterate, you need to come up with names for him that alliterate. So for example, we need a name that alliterates with F for Odin. Oh, well, you can call him Fimbulthulur, and that's clear that he is the exceedingly great poet, and obviously that's Odin. So that's kind of how it goes. There are just so many names for Odin. When the god of poetry is the god most talked about in poetry. Yeah, so true. That's what you come to expect, which means there's just like a thick Odin bias in a lot of the text that we have, just like in terms of amount of mentions of him compared to other gods. And sort of resultingly, there's a heavy emphasis of worship of Odin now in neo-paganism, because he's the god you can most easily find stuff about, because there's the most written about him. And yeah, but that doesn't necessarily mean he was the most important god at the time. He was just the most important god to poets, clearly. But poets are only a small percentage of the population, of course. So it's always something to keep in mind. It's like, who's composing this? A poet. So they're gonna like the poetry deity a lot. All right, we're gonna go to the next stanza, and we're gonna get more about, guess who? It's Odin. And we get one of my favorite alliterative verse formulae here too, because we have Odin med asum en fyr alvum dagen dvalen og dvergum fyr asvider jatnum fyr ek reist sjálfur sumar. So the formula that shows up here is Alvin McAwesome and for Alvum Dain. It's the sort of juxtaposition of Awesome and Alvum, which are gods, awesome, in the dative plural, and Alvum, which are elves. Gods and elves are always paired in that order with these two words. Os and Alver. They're always paired in that way, in that order, in alliterative pairs. And this is one of the many examples of it that shows up. There's actually quite a few in hávamál itself, just that one poem that have the formula show up a few times. I'm going to add the other accents actually to this. And I think I might have made a mistake in transcribing this, because I think, if I remember correctly, and we're on the next page so I can close this one, I think it was a small capital N, wasn't it? It is a small capital N. And I was going to say, because I'm like, there should be two N's here grammatically, and there are, because it's a small capital N. Yeah, so Odin med awesome. So Odin with, so med is with, like among, Odin among the gods, en för alvum dain. So before or for the elves, dain. Now, dain, if you are a Tolkien fan, I know not everyone viewing currently is, but if you're a Tolkien fan, or have read The Hobbit, or I think his name actually only really shows up in the appendices to The Lord of the Rings. Oh yeah, among. Yeah, I said the A word. I end up saying it a lot in these streams because of the among men formula that comes up a lot. Yeah, so Dain is a dwarf in Tolkien's universe. He is Dain of the Iron Hills. He spells it with one N, and it gets pronounced Dane a lot of the time. Dane or Dain, but it's Dain. Dain, and it's actually the past participle of the verb daya, which means to die. So it means dead, or died, past participle, but it's used adjectively here, kind of, so it might as well mean dead, like dead one. Why is he named dead? Who knows? Why is he an elf here? So, like for the elves, this person named Dain did something. We don't even actually have our verb yet. He's an elf here, it seems, because it's for the elves. Odin is a god, and he did something with gods. Dvalin here, we have dvergum, which are dwarves. We're pretty sure Dvalin is a dwarf here. Another Tolkien character, if you're familiar with Dwalin, he was one of the 13 dwarfs that goes with Bilbo in The Hobbit. This is him, Dvalin. Obviously, it's not him in The Hobbit. This is just the same name that Tolkien took. These names both show up in the Völuspá as names of dwarves, but here Dain is an elf. And this is just one of the many examples where we get confusion or just sort of ambiguity about what the difference between an elf and a dwarf even is. If there is a clear one, there seems to be some kind of difference in some texts, and then in others, what difference? It's very interesting, this whole elf-dwarf thing, and I've actually written about it before. But here, Dain is doing something for the elves, and Dvalin is doing something for the dwarves. Asvider jotnum för. So, this should be long, actually. Oh, I should talk about what Dvalin means. Dvalin, the actual meaning of this name isn't entirely clear, but some ideas are that it's related to the verb dvelja, which means to stay, and dvali, which is dormancy or hibernation or lethargy, all of which come from the root dwalas in Proto-Germanic, which means stunned. So it's like one who is in a stupor or tired, one who's tired. I almost suspect that the seven dwarves of Snow White seem to also come from inspiration from Old Norse, and I feel like some of their names are also inspired here. And I feel like if there's any dwarf among the 7 dwarves that Dvalin is related to, it might be Dopey, because of that meaning of dwalas as like stunned or in a stupor, like in a state of not really knowing what's going on. Now, I feel like there's a lot about the depiction of Dopey in that movie that's pretty aged poorly, I think. But I do think that the Disney people might have been thinking of this name. Perhaps. Maybe I'm giving them too much credit. But I have been able to find analogs for most of the dwarves, the 7 dwarves in Old Norse naming, at least. And I think Dwalin might be a good candidate for Dopey. I keep accidentally moving my cursor down, and that's really really getting annoying. So where was I? Osvidr. So Osvidr for the Jotnum. He was the only mute one. Skull emoji. Yeah. Yeah, looking back on how Dopey is depicted as interesting reveals a lot about the attitude towards certain people in the 1930s. So, Jotnum is the dative plural of Jotun, which is Jotun. I've talked about them before, I believe, on stream. They often get translated as giants, though it doesn't necessarily literally mean they're big. They're like sort of a, I guess, like class or race or tribe of entities that seem on par with or similar to gods, but they're not with them. I'm not going to go into a whole thing about my opinion on Jotun here. There's just scholarship-wise, they're just seen as like a different class of otherworldly being who are generally at enmity with the gods that most of the myths are about, but sometimes they're not. Like sometimes there's a Jotun who's just hanging out amongst the other, like the gods, and they're chill, or they are both a Jotun and a god. It's another situation, kind of like the Elf and Dwarf thing, where there don't seem to be like harsh lines, but more like it depends on the text you're reading here. But they seem to be separate here, but I say that Osvidr for the Jotuns. Osvidr, if we break it down, it's Os, which means God, just like awesome up here, and Vidr, I didn't amend this, this should be an Ev here, which means wood. I think we had this word already, Vidr, in the first one. No, we didn't. We didn't have Vidr here, did we? I thought we had it somewhere in this poem. It might have been the last poem. It actually might have been in the Norwegian rune poem that this word came up. But it's cognate to the word wood in English, Osvidr. It means wood or forest or tree, basically. So tree, like God tree, God wood, is the name of this Jotun. Apparently that's what it is. So Osvidr, Jotnumfyr. What did they do? All we get is Ek reist sjálfur sumar. I carved myself some. I carved some myself. Who's I? Because last time I checked, the speaker in the hávamál is Odin, but Odin said here already that Odin among the gods, and for the elves Dain, for the dwarves Dvalin, and for the Jotuns Osvidr. I carve some myself. Okay. We actually don't have a verb, really, for all of these sort of little phrases here. They're not really clauses, they're just phrases. I think we're supposed to understand that they maybe are making or painting. Maybe it's one of these verbs that we're supposed to, like, draw down here into this stanza somehow. Or draw this verb rista up into all these, like, they each carved runes for their respective peoples, and it's just Odin's just repeating himself when he's talking about himself doing it for the gods. Notable here is that we don't get any for people. So maybe Odin is doing them among the gods for the gods, but then also he's repeating himself and saying, I wrote some too, because in the sort of meta-narrative of Hávamál, he's talking to people, and so maybe he's like, I also made some for people, but that's kind of implied. I don't know. That's one interpretation one could take from it, but it's not here in the text. What happened over here? Not sure what happened there. Okay. Let's go into the next stanza, and here we get some abbreviation. I'm going to show what it looks like in the manuscript. So I'm going to zoom out actually first. Actually, like partial zoom. I think I can. Actually, yeah, let's partial zoom. So here we get a very fancy looking V, which I like how these V's look. Before we saw they were using the letter that is analogous to win in Old English, the one that looks kind of like a P. But here they're using like a fancy V, and I really like how that looks. So we get veistu. I'm going to do it in the manuscript first because I want to show you what the abbreviations are. So we have veistu. Sorry, I should be pronouncing this as W, shouldn't I? Veistu hue, rista, and then we have this S, and then an L, and then like a curl going through the L. And that is a very common abbreviation for the word skal, which is cognate to shall, or must. Or just, I think we had this in Old English too, where they used the word shall, the verb shulan, to be like an sort of epistemic, gnomic word that means it is true that this thing is the case. But here probably means something more like should, or something in that realm. We'll go through it when I start translating, but veistu hue rista skal, veistu hue rada skal, and then we have VH fo skal abbreviation, VH fresta skal abbreviation, VH bidya skal abbreviation, and it keeps going like that. So what this is, the VH is just simply abbreviating veistu hue, because they didn't want to have to write it over and over again. They wrote it twice, and then once they did it twice, they were like, you get the picture. Like stimmen in German. What's like stimmen in German? While you answer that, I will keep going. So, weißt du hue? This means, do you know? Do you know how? The verb that means to be true. I think there are actually cognates in both Old English and Old Norse for that, but it's not quite like literally to be true, but just it is the case that this thing always happens. Like it must happen. I don't know if stimmen is used that way because I don't speak German, but maybe. You tell me if that's how it is. Weißt du, though, means do you know. It's the verb vita in the second person singular, and then hue is like how in this context. So, weißt du hue, and this should be long. Weißt du hue. Do you know how? And then we have rista, and this is that same verb that we keep seeing in the past. Reist, ek reist, I carved. So, do you know how rista skal? So, do you know how should carve? Shall carve? Carving should be? A lot of people interpret this because older Germanic languages are a lot more okay with pronoun dropping, including objects here. They think that the object here is runar, runes. Like, do you know how runes should be carved? Do you know how to carve runes, basically? Do you know how runes should be carved? Do you know how runes should be, and this is that verb rada again, which is to interpret or to read. So I'm going to read it once through all the way in Old Norse, and then I'm going to read it through in, we're going to finish translating it. So, Waits du hwe rista skal, waits du hwe rada skal, waits du hwe fa skal, waits du hwe freista skal, waits du hwe bidja skal, waits du hwe blåta skal, waits du hwe senda skal, waits du hwe sa skal. So do you know how they should be carved? Do you know how to carve them? Do you know how to read them? Do you know how to, and this is that verb fall again, that means paint. Do you know how to paint them or draw them? Veist du hve freista skal? Do you know how to try or prove them? Do you know how to test them? Veist du hve bidja skal? Do you know how to bid them? Do you know how to ask them something? Veist du hve blåta skal? Do you know how to sacrifice them? Blåta is to sacrifice. Veist du hve senda skal? Do you know how to send them? Veist du hve soa skal? Now, soa is probably the trickiest word in this stanza, because soa is not a very common verb in either Old or Modern Icelandic. Soa in Modern Icelandic means to waste or squander something. But its cognates, like, I think there is a German cognate, Sühne, which is, I think, archaic, but it means atonement. And there is a word, son, in Old Norse that means atonement. That's probably related. So soa might have meant something like to atone, or going more towards like the waste, meaning maybe something like spend. Do you know how to send them? Do you know how to spend them? We're not sure how to interpret this verb. Like, there's a lot of disagreement about how to interpret this verb. We're also not sure if the runes is the actual object here. I think that's the most likely thing, because we have carve, interpret, paint, /draw, and ask. The ask is a little bit more iffy, but the carving them, reading them, and drawing them all tells me that it's about letters, something about letters. So we should be maybe assuming that it should be something to do with the runes, especially since this is the topic that we're in right now. So I am going to move on to the next stanza unless there are any questions about this one. It's really interesting to see this kind of repetition, I actually will say. The alliteration is pretty clear. It's in pairs here. And the alliteration is kept still on the first stress if we don't stress this part of it, which it's pretty easy to do if you're saying it really quickly. But it's still a very interesting style of literature verse. It's going to be 1 second. Okay. Last stanza, unless there are any questions about this one. Is there anything to say about the manuscript part of this? What happened? Oh. There we go. We are here in the manuscript. I don't think there's anything super interesting to point out. Actually, I might explain that little abbreviation there in a second, but we'll get to it. So, where are we? I lost my place again. There we go. Petra. Yeah, there we go. I will just go ahead. Actually, I'm going to start by amending some things that should be changed. Mostly it's just adding length where it is not indicated in the original. And some other vowel stuff mostly. För han upp. Should be two P's here. Omreist. Okay. We are all amended to more normalized a little bit. There's still some things I didn't change. I left the V's for U's and stuff like that, the thorns where there should be eds probably, because it didn't really make a difference back then. So I'm going to go ahead and read it now and then translate. So we've got Betra obedet än se avblåtith. Ej ser till gildes gaf. Betra osent än se avsåit. This is supposed to be that, yeah. Se avsåit. Svafunder omreist för thjóða rock. Thar han upp omreis han after of kam. Alright, so what's going on here? We've got some actual repetition of the verbs we had in this stanza. So we've got obedet, which is actually the past participle of bidya, but with the prefix o, which is cognate to un in English. This is a thing that happens in Old Norse that oftentimes coda nasal in sort of a prefix will just become length on the prior vowel instead. This also happens with the preposition all, which is cognate with on in Old English. On is just aw. Alright. So obethet here is unbidden. Like it's the past tense of bidya, which is to ask. So it's better, betra obethet, it's better unasked en se avblåtith than se, which is this is the subjunctive of vera, which is to be. So this is like then to be, hypothetically, avblåtith. Avblåtith here means overly, and then blåtith is the past participle of this verb, blåta, to sacrifice or to offer, give an offering. So it's better to be unasked than to be overly sacrificed or overly offered. And then we have a, and this doesn't actually need to have a hook. It has a hook in the original, but normalized this actually doesn't have a hook. A ser till gildes gjof. So always, I think we had the word a in Old English that meant always, which is cognate. So a ser till gildes gjof. Now this ser here is probably actually the third person singular of the verb sjå, which is to see. And then till is actually towards or to, and it takes the genitive here. So this is the noun gildi, and it's in the genitive, which is why there's an S there. Till gildi, till gildis. Gildi is payment or tribute. It is cognate. It has cognates in Old English, and it's cognate with guild and with guilt, I'm pretty sure as well. Things that you owe. It's cognate with the word gold, I believe. And then we have the noun gjof, which is gift. It's cognate with yivu in Old English. Yivu is gift. It's just the noun gift. So always sees for payment gift. How do we interpret that? Well, it's better to be unasked than to be over-offered. A gift always looks for payment. So a gift is always, so like if someone gives you something, it's looking for some kind of return. That's what it's saying here. So it's better not to ask than to over-offer, or to be overly offered, maybe. Because if you ask for something, they're going to want something in return, perhaps. Maybe that's what it's saying here. And then it says, Betra osent en se avsåit. So again, we have the same pair. So we had bidya and blåta up here, and we had obedet and avblåtith here. Now we have the same bottom pair, senda and soa. Here we have osent and avsåit. These authors are so grim about gift giving. Yeah, this isn't a universal attitude. Also, like, other parts of the hávamál talk about freely giving. Like, you should give to people, and, you know, they could give to you. Like, there's a lot of stanzas in this poem about generosity, like the overall poem, that we're not reading because it's very long. But there's also a lot of stanzas about not giving too much of your stuff. Like, make sure you have stuff too. There are a lot of, like, that seem to contradict each other, like contradictory stanzas. Like, don't give too much, or you'll be giving too much of yourself. And, like, don't take too many gifts, or it'll seem like you're greedy. But also, give gifts to people. Be generous. A good host gives gifts. Yeah, basically, it kind of all lands in, like, a use your judgment. Use your own judgment and pay attention to the context, I guess. But it does, at first read, always kind of seem kind of weird to read something like that. Like, it does seem kind of cynical. But here we get the same pair, like I was saying. So we have bidja and blota, and we have obedet of blotit. Here we have senda soa and osent of sowit. So what does it mean? So it is better unsent than to be over whatever the heck soa means, right? I talked about how that is a little ambiguous. We're not sure. It probably means something like spent or wasted or atoned, but that seems kind of weird too, especially with the context. I think it's better unsent than overly spent. I think this is kind of tempering what we just read, maybe. Kind of like I was just saying, a lot of this stuff kind of contradicts itself. Like, it's better to not ask for something than to overly offer, because a gift is always looking for recompense. It's better it's better unsent than overspent. Don't give too much of your stuff because it's better than offering, like spending too much. Seems kind of interesting here. Then we get swa thunder umreist. So, or thus, thunder, carved about. So we have ristagen reist, he carved about that, for thjóða rock. And then rock means a lot of possible things. This could be the rock that's in the word Ragnarok, which is often translated as like the doom of the gods. It's also sometimes translated as the twilight of the gods because of that other possible rock. It could have been Rukker instead of rock. But rock, it can be like fate, destiny, doom, judgment, reason. It could be a lot of things. I think judgment or... I think judgment works the best here. Thus, so, swa, or thus, thunder, carved about them for the judgment of the people, thjóða. This is cognate with theoda in Old English, genitive plural theoda, theod meaning people. So, for the judgment of the people, or before the judgment of the people. Who's thunder? Who wants to guess who thunder is in the chat? Who is thunder yet another name of? It's not necessarily who it sounds like, but yes, thank you. It is Odin. Yeah, it's another name for Odin. Thunder. Now, you might be a little confused because thunder sounds an awful lot like the word thunder. Oh yeah, let's go first. Yeah, nice job. So, thunder does sound like the English word thunder quite a bit. And isn't Thor the god of thunder? Yes, Thor is the god of thunder. That is... Oh, there we go. Now, there's some actual problems with the etymology. Yeah, so someone else in the chat said they were going to say Thor. Yeah, that would have been not the worst guess. There is a word thund that shows up sometimes that might be related to Thor. This is where it gets very tricky, because the Proto-Germanic word that is the root of the word thunder in modern English, which comes from Old English thunor, This is probably from the Proto-Germanic word thunras, which means thunder. And that's tricky because we don't really have any other Proto-Germanic words with this sort of cluster of U and R that end up in Old Norse. And so it's not really clear what would happen. Now, this Oz becoming a second R totally makes sense. But this und before an R, there's not a lot of precedent for it. It's very possible that it could become like this, like an O. And then like there's that sort of nasal going away thing that we saw up here with obedet. And that's how you get Thor out of Thunras. It's possible. We just aren't really sure. Now, the reason there's a D in the English word thunder is what's called, it's an example of epenthesis. Because thunur in Old English often was pronounced thunr, with just like a syllabic R, and the O is just how they spelled that. And it was pretty common for people to put an intrusive consonant in there, like a D there. And that's how we got a D in thunder in modern English. And it's possible that a similar thing could have happened in Old Norse. So it is possible that thunder is actually the word for thunder, and it just happens to refer to Odin and not our friend Thor, who we tend to associate with thunder. But it's all very unclear. Jackson Crawford actually has a different idea. He doesn't think it's thunder. I also am not sure that it's thunder. I don't necessarily think that it's thunder. Jackson Crawford thinks it's related to this verb thenia. Thenia means to stretch. It's cognate with thin in modern English. And that thunder is some kind of old past participle type thing with a zero grade that would lead to there being a U here. That then became, so it was like the stretched one, which I think Jackson Crawford connects it to the first stanza of this poem where Odin is hanging himself. So he was stretched in that way on the tree while he didn't eat and didn't have drink, and then survived because he's a god. So some people think that that might be what was going on. Jackson Crawford is the first person I've seen to say that, and a lot of people agree with him. But I'm still not sure what I personally think. It's just an unclear etymology. But it is another name for Odin. Okay, so this last line, we have Thar han upp reist, han after of kam. So, where he up, about, rose. So where he came up, when he after came from there. He came off, which is like about or around. So, I've seen a lot of different translations of this last line, but it seems to be kind of referring back to this narrative we had of the 9 days and nights thing. So it's better unasked than over offered. It's better unsent than overspent. So Odin wrote about for the judgment of people, where he rose up among them, maybe, when he came again among them. So after here, it's probably again. It's when he came among them again, maybe after his hanging on the tree, hanging out on the tree. All right, so that is the end of Rúnatal. This is just a small section of the later part of hávamál. I definitely recommend reading the whole hávamál because there is a lot of interesting advice in there. Some of it is cool. Some of it is probably something that a lot of modern people wouldn't agree with or might interpret differently in the modern context. But I still think it's a worthwhile read because it's very interesting. And I have the copy that Jackson Crawford wrote, the Wanderer's Hávamál. He is liberal with his translation in that he doesn't always translate things literally, which is, I think, a good thing sometimes. I think it's good to see literal translations and also more poetic translations. He doesn't try to make it fit a meter, which I do appreciate, because when people try to make it fit a meter in English, they end up sacrificing a lot of the meaning in Norse. So he just tries to go for something that seems idiomatic, like something that would make sense of what he interprets the Norse to mean, and then convey that in modern English, which is something that a lot of people like about his style. But if you're trying to learn Old Norse, it's not necessarily the best source, just because he's not giving you what the literal words mean. He's giving you like the gist of the stanza overall. But he does a very good job. And it's also fun. He has of course, the cowboy hávamál at the end, where it's the wisdom of the hávamál told from his, I can't remember, I think it's his grandfather that it's written from. I can't remember if it's his father or his grandfather. I think it's his grandfather. And that's pretty fun to read too. Definitely a fun text. And this section, the rune-related section, is why we chose it, was also fun to read. So next week, we'll be back into rune poetry. We're going to do our final rune poem, which is the Icelandic rune poem, which is pretty fun. It's going to be in ljóðaháttr verse, and it's also going to have some Latin Easter eggs in there too. Each stanza has a Latin word thrown in, which is also fun to see when it comes to interpreting the runes, what Latin word these Icelanders chose to associate with their runes. So that's something to look forward to next week. It will be the same time, same place on Twitch. And if you have any questions, this stream, as always, will be uploaded pretty soon, within hopefully the hour. And you can always ask questions in the comments on YouTube, and the YouTube is linked through Twitch if you go to my Twitch profile. Other than that, if no one has any questions, I'm going to say good night, good day, good whatever time zone it is to everyone who's watching, and anyone in the future watching this. Thank you for taking the time to hang out with me and read the rúnatal. Thank you. Goodbye.